That film, I think, reminds us powerfully that there is a special role for the message about the humanitarian impact of nuclear war. Too often, discussions about international policy get caught up in these incredibly convoluted, unproductive discussions about game theory, about national priorities. It just, no, we don't get anywhere. But when we focus on the threat to human beings, on the humanitarian danger posed by nuclear war, we have seen repeatedly that we can break through and get people to actually start doing the things that need to be done. And I think that was perhaps the greatest lesson that we learned from the early experience of IPPNW, despite the incredible hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union, when we were able to frame this not as a political question, not as a military question, but as a question of medicine, of humanitarian impacts, of human survival. People on both sides of this very bitter divide at that time were able to come together, recognizing their common humanity, and do the things that needed to be done. This year, the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we are particularly reminded of the danger posed by nuclear weapons. Although I think the most important thing that we need to remember about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for the destruction that modern nuclear weapons would cause. And we are concerned here about all weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, but I think it's appropriate to focus for a bit on the nuclear weapons in particular, because even within this terrible category of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons are unique. Unique in their destructiveness, their ability to cause untold human suffering, and in their ability to end our civilization, which no other weapon that we possess really can do. But nuclear weapons can. They do it quickly. They can do it in an instant. They could do it today while we're sitting here talking. I want to talk a little bit about what nuclear weapons can do, and then I want to talk a little bit about the particular relevance of the Middle East to the global global struggle to prevent nuclear war. We have learned in recent decades that the effects of a nuclear war will be even more devastating than we previously thought. Back in the 1980s, in that era of Soviet-US confrontation, we believed it was only a war between the United States and the Soviet Union with their massive nuclear arsenals that would put the world as a whole at risk. What we now understand is that even a much more limited nuclear war would have consequences, catastrophic consequences across the entire planet. We have studied particularly the case of South Asia, but a war elsewhere in the world, including potentially a future war in the Middle East, could have similar consequences. The data that has been generated about South Asian situation, however, is very robust and is worth looking at for a few minutes. The most recent update of this ongoing study, which was released in September of last year, showed that a war in South Asia involving less than 0.1% of the world's nuclear arsenals, that war could kill between 75 and 125 million people in the first week, from the explosions, from the fires, from the radiation. But even more frightening was the realization that the fires started by these nuclear explosions would cause worldwide climate disruption. The smoke blown into the upper atmosphere would block out the sun, cooling the planet, cutting down precipitation across the entire planet, and having a severe negative impact on food production, not just in South Asia, but again across the entire world. And that this would trigger a famine that would put up to 2 billion people at risk. Again, not just in South Asia, but everywhere, in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in North America, in Europe. A famine which put 2 billion people at risk would not mean the extinction of our species, but it would unquestionably be the end of civilization as we know it. No civilization in human history has ever withstood a shock of this magnitude, and there is no reason to believe that the very fragile economic system which we all depend on to put food on our tables, to heat our homes, to provide clothing, there's no reason to believe that this fragile economic system would survive a disruption on this scale. Now, this is a limited nuclear war involving a very small portion of the world's nuclear arsenals. If we stumble into a major nuclear war between the United States and Russia, the consequences are even more horrible. Uh, we don't have 75 to 125 million people dead in the first week. We have close to 500 million people dead directly from the fires and the explosions and the radiation in the first week. But even more importantly, we have climate disruption that is even more profound. The smoke from a large-scale war between the United States and Russia would cool this planet basically to a degree that would create a new human, man-made nuclear ice age. We would create conditions that we have not seen on this planet in 18,000 years. This is the coldest moment of the last naturally occurring ice age. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, temperatures would drop an average of 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. For 3 years, there would not be a single day free of frost in the northern hemisphere, meaning temperatures would go below freezing at least some time every single day. And under those kinds of conditions, all of the ecosystems that have evolved over the last 15,000 years would collapse. Food production would essentially stop, and the vast majority of the human race would starve to death. In fact, under these conditions, it is possible that we would become extinct as a species. Now, this is a danger which we face every day. This is not the plot of a bad movie. This is the threat that we have created for ourselves and which continues to threaten the existence of our civilization every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. This terribly dangerous situation, I think, has particular relevance to the situation in the Middle East for 2 reasons. First, the very intense rivalries among nations in the Middle East and the degree to which outside nuclear powers have become entangled in those rivalries mean that the Middle East could well be the site which triggers a nuclear war. And that could be even if nuclear weapons are not first used in the Middle East, even if there's not a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, but simply given the current nuclear arsenals that exist around the world. Secondly, the Middle East is particularly vulnerable to the effects of nuclear war. Again, not just a nuclear war that might take place in the Middle East, but a war such as the one I just described between India and Pakistan. The Middle East is one of the most food insecure portions of the planet. It suffers chronic water shortages as well. And because of this, it would be particularly vulnerable to the disruption in food production that would follow a nuclear war any place on the planet. And so for this reason, there's a particular need for people in the Middle East, in their own interest, not only to make sure that the Middle East does not get into a nuclear arms race, does not become the site of a local nuclear war, but also to provide leadership to the entire global community, because it is urgently in the interest of the people of the Middle East that all nuclear weapons everywhere on the planet be abolished. Now, fortunately, as we know, there is a path forward that has been created by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the work for which ICANN won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, and for which IPPNW has played, I think, a very important role. That treaty sets forth a roadmap that we can follow to a world free of nuclear weapons. That is not a fantasy. That is a practical necessity. If we are going to survive as a civilization, if the human family is going to realize its potential, we have got to eliminate these nuclear weapons. There's no choice. It is unreasonable to think that we can continue to maintain these arsenals for the indefinite future and not experience the terrible destruction that I've just referred to. And so we, all of us, need to figure out how to bring this treaty into force. And we need to figure out how then to use this treaty to get the nations which possess nuclear weapons to enter into the further negotiations which they need to establish a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to dismantle the remaining nuclear weapons. And I think that the peoples of the Middle East could play an enormously important role in moving that process forward. We really have to understand that if we do not take this action, if we do not move to eliminate these weapons quickly, terrible, terrible consequences are going to happen. but that is not the future that must be. These weapons are not a force of nature. It is not as though an asteroid is coming at us from outer space. These weapons are little machines which we have built with our own hands, and we know how to take them apart. All that is missing is the political will to do that. And we, all of us, have a responsibility to make the nuclear armed states recognize the danger they are exposing the rest of the world to and eliminate their nuclear arsenals. The choice is up to us. And if we make the right choice, and if we act decisively and with courage and with determination, we can eliminate these weapons. We can save the world from this terrible danger. Thank you.